Okay.
Uh, Hello, today I'm here with Etruscan author of many books, H.L. Hicks, and he has contributed a poem to our anthology, Sign and Breath. Welcome, Harvey.
Hi, thanks, Phil. Thanks for having me.
I'm just going to ask you to start by reading the poem.
Great, great, thanks. Yeah, so the poem is called, the title of the poem is a question. They find their way by these stories. And so I'll just read the poem. They find their way by these stories. In my family, the matriarch gets to tell about the patriarch one nearly fell story. In my mother's, it's a spring day, Oklahoma, rainy. My grandfather, a postal carrier, old days, small town, leather shoulder bag, on foot, slips on wet grass, slides down a hill, longer each telling, on his butt, but bounces upright at the bottom, not a letter lost or wet. In my mother's, it's winter, South Texas, freak storm, metal fire escape steps slicked, a coat of ice. My father slips on each, misses none, dances down without losing his feet. We laugh like we laughed last summer, last Christmas.
That's beautiful, Harvey. Thank you. And Harvey, tell us about this page. As you know, the anthology is based upon the idea of one page that sings, which actually comes from a tagline of yours, nothing attested, everything sung. So tell us why you chose this particular poem for this anthology.
Yeah, the poem is, in a way, because it's a sonnet, it has, for me, a sort of peculiar relationship to singing, because the sonnet is, in some ways, seems like in English, it has become, it's a very familiar form, a comfortable form for us. There's such a long tradition of sonnets in the English language. Even though sonnets didn't originate in English, they sort of, the English, as they did so many things, took what they wanted from someone else. But it has become very familiar in English and very comfortable for us. And yet it's oddly, it seems like an oddly page-bound form to me in a certain way. There's a kind of the musical structure feels to me like the structure of a composition that was first written down. So in other words, for me, the music of a sonnet feels like the music of a formal classical composer who thinks in their head and writes it down on the page, and then someone performs it. Then the pianist and the symphony and whatever perform this piece. So it feels like it like it comes off the page and then is performed, as compared to folk music, other kinds of music that feel like somebody sang it first and it was passed down from at the bar or wherever, passed down from person to person many times before anybody thought to write it down. So there's something funny about the sonnet for me that feels like the musicality is a particular kind of musicality. And so that was one reason for just thinking of a sonnet as a choice. And I had some fun with this sonnet, some sort of musical fun with this sonnet, because the stories that it records have some fun to them. And so I wanted the music to try to reflect that, the pleasure of the stories, because they're orally communicated stories. But I know these stories not because anybody's ever written them down. So far as I know, nobody had until this poem. But I've heard them. I've heard both of these stories 1,000 times if I've heard them once. and so there's something. So for me, this poem occupies a sort of funny space in relation to orality and to music and to the page. So that was a reason for for thinking of this poem in particular for the anthology.
That's so interesting, Harvey. And of course, you have a long history with sonnets all the way back to Perfect Hell, rational numbers, and you've written a number of sonnet sequences. So this is a form that has been as part of your practice, I suspect, for your entire poetic career.
Yeah.
Would you say that some of those factors also characterize the more complex forms which you have both used and invented
Right.
on the page? Would you say that, in other words, the sonnet you mentioned is as a musical form that seems composed, if not for the page, at least originally on the page? How does that speak to, as I say, the longer, more complicated, and sometimes original forms that you have made? Would you say that's also the major impulse, or are there multiple impulses?
Yeah, there are multiple impulses, but the sonnet it's definitely, yeah, central for me and originary and generative for me, um, um, because it seems to me to exemplify with a particular sort of vividness um, the ways in which not only musicality, but even more generally structure is generative of meaning. And it creates meaning and shapes meaning. And so I'm thinking of something as simple as the relative proportion, 8 lines, 6 lines, even when that's manipulated from the sort of older Petrarchan octave and sestet, even when it's manipulated into the Shakespearean sort of 3 4-line units and a couplet, there's still something about the ratio of setup to completion that has so much to do, it seems to me, with the question of timing. And so I think in any narrative form, timing is always important, and in music, timing is always important. There's always some form of build up and completion. Something that happens, we can call it whatever we want, go one direction and then take a turn for another, or rising action, falling action, however we want to talk about it. There's some sort of a preparation and some sort of a completion in a song, in a story, and it's in all the elements of the song or the story. It's in the even if it's a song with lyrics, the music itself has this, the same thing happens. You start in one key and you gotta end in the same key. So you might go off into something else, but you end in the same key. And if you're playing 1, 4, 5 chords, you got to come back to the one chord. So we have this sense of preparation and completion as a structure that we respond to. And the sonnet is just so beautifully, visibly and audibly, that you can see it on the page, but you can also hear it. If you're hearing somebody read it to you and you're not seeing the page, you still hear that, the buildup and the completion, the way you hear it in a story. So it seems really, the sonnet seems really illuminative to me in that regard about, I think, all narrative and all poetry and all music. I think there's always some version of this preparation, completion that's always going to happen. And so, I think the sonnet has been provocative for me, both in trying to work with it and against it. Have tried over the years, have tried to write sonnets that are sonnets and tried to write sonnets that aren't, and so tried to push back against the sonnet and tried to hide sonnets where you only hear them but don't see them, and tried to create sonnets that are visibly sonnets but not audibly sonnets, and so on. So just tried to think about the sonnet itself, but also have tried to think about these questions of proportion. Does the sonnet alert me to something that I can then replicate in a form that's not the sonnet, that's maybe not the same proportions, maybe not the same way of preparing and completing, but that still is a way of preparing and completing. So yes, sorry for the long-winded answer to the question, but the short answer is yes, the sonnet has been inspiring in that way, that even the forms that I have created, there's still some kind of influence from the sonnet involved. Yeah.
Well, I think that's amazing because, again, the sonnet being something that seems complete and has proportions, but at the same time, writers like yourself have written sonnet sequences, and the sonnet sequence seems to be probably the most common means whereby the sonnet not only becomes complete, but in a sense projects beyond completion. And I think about that. When I think about your work, so much of it has to do with both finding proportion and challenging proportion, in the way that postmodern and modern writers oftentimes are, pushing against that idea of closure. And it's fascinating that you found these both impulses in this one sonnet, but we might add, of course, this, like many of your other sonnets, is part of a much larger project. Right. How It Is That We, which is forthcoming from Etruscan Press. We're very happy to say.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Harvey. We look forward to both seeing How It Is That We, and also to our anthology, Sign and Breath. And we might add that you have given us the tagline that we've been using for years as part of our Etruscan Prize: nothing attested, everything sung. H.L. Hicks.
Thanks, Phil.